So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, colleagues. A very warm welcome to this third installment of the seminar series of the Perivoli Africa Research Center. We're really delighted that you have been able to join us. At PARC, we see this seminar series very much as part of our mission to advance a transformative mode of research collaborations with Africa in pursuit of the broader goal of rebalancing, redressing the entrenched inequities in the global research ecosystem, and in doing so, fostering a richer and more potent academic effort globally. Our series, therefore, explores questions, among others, regarding the positioning of African scholars, institutions, and countries within the global research ecosystem, as well as opportunities and approaches for and implications of fostering African epistemic leadership. And today's seminar speaks squarely and importantly to these issues. And it is with immense pleasure and gratitude that I now welcome and introduce our speaker for today, Professor Kenneth Matengu. Professor Matengu is Vice Chancellor of the University of Namibia. He is President of the Association of African Universities and President of the Council of the Pan-African University, as well as a member of the Council of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And amid all of this, we are hugely and profoundly honored that Professor Matengu has agreed to be the chair of PARC's advisory board as well. In and through his national, continental, and international roles, Professor Matengu has, among many other contributions, led transformative initiatives to strengthen research, innovation, and international collaboration, as well as deepen integration and harmonizing quality assurance across Africa's higher education institutions. A visionary academic leader, Professor Matengu champions Africa's potential to emerge as a great continent through the dynamism of its education and research systems, the power of its youth, and the sustainable utilization of its resources. To this end, Professor Matengu leads advocacy for increased national research funding, for the translation of Africa's scientific and natural resource assets into locally led innovation and jobs, and in many ways undergirding all of this, campaigns for the continent's intellectual sovereignty. And the question of intellectual sovereignty is also very much at the heart of Professor Matengu's lectures today. Professor Matengu will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and we will then open the floor for active discussion, hopefully with all of you. So, without further delay, I thank you, Kenneth, and hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabella, for that kind introduction. I'm hoping that my presentation is not going to be too boring, and that we will interact together in this. I hope that you can see my screen.
We can see, but it's not on presentation mode yet. So maybe you can put on presentation mode at the bottom. Yeah. Not yet. Try again.
Not reacting. Okay.
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. No, as Isabella indicated, I'm going to attempt to talk a bit about the case for African intellectual sovereignty. This is a very important topic that I will not exhaust in any way in this 30 minutes or so of talk. But what I hope to do is to ignite some questions and interest on why it is an interesting issue especially for African higher education. In doing so, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of decolonizing of knowledge. And maybe also, how do we know that African or intellectual sovereignty isn't or is in place in Africa? basically intellectual sovereignty and knowledge sovereignty and cannot be decoupled from colonization or decolonization of knowledge systems. Because what we find in Africa is basically a system that has been put in place during the colonial times, and it has, in many instances, doesn't recognize or respect local knowledge. And this is an important issue because it also, in a way, marginalizes local languages. Africa has many, many languages, and what you would find as dominant language through which education and research is practiced is mostly the language of the colonial systems. English, French, and Portuguese mainly. You find in countries like Namibia also German language as well. So it is a pressing issue due to concerns of historical, geopolitical, and systemic factors that challenge the continent's ability to control and benefit from its own intellectual, cultural, and technological resources. There are, in my mind, several reasons why it is of concern today. One is the legacy of colonial intellectual property systems. This basically, what we have seen is we have IP laws that are heavily influenced by colonial legal systems, which often disregard indigenous knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. The result being that it creates a gap in which the mismatch between the Western IP frameworks and Africa's oral and traditional knowledge systems ignored, leaving local innovations and cultural heritage underrepresented and unprotected. Linking to this is the recognition of traditional knowledge and language heritage. You may know the famous cases of Hoodia and Devil's Claw that have been patented elsewhere, even though the local knowledge holders are based here, the San communities. We have also seen traditional African art forms like rock art and bronze sculpturing that are not adequately recognized under current copyright regimes, which prioritize Western notion of originality and fixation. Some institutions like the University of South Africa have tried to recognize this by basically awarding a doctoral degree, but not just in terms of honoring an artist, but they have also used some of their scientists to do the calculations of the patterns, the whole weaving in an art form that shows that there is logic, there is thinking, there is systematic approach to the art that Africans do. And that is something that is often ignored in the current knowledge systems. The exploitation of genetic and cultural resources is also another important issue that is not recognized in terms of the heritage that Africa has. African population hold unique genomic variations. The lack of robust protections has led to fears of exploitation by different corporations and researchers. The third item is globalization and technological dependency. And I will use the data from the whiteboard to show what is actually happening. So Africa's technological infrastructure and digital networks are often shaped by external powers, mainly from the United States, China, and Europe, which limits African agency in the global knowledge economy. This dependency raises concerns about Africa's ability to independently govern its own technological and intellectual futures. The efforts to balance technological independence with global interdependencies are ongoing, but the narrative often portrays African nations as passive recipients rather than active shapers of their technological destinies. In this regard, we also see that Africa's efforts towards sustainable development is not recognized and measured in the way that it should. Many of the measures that are measuring the sustainable development doesn't take into account what the good practices that the village or people in the villages are doing. And I will show you why that is the case. But there is also
Kenneth, we can't see your slides. We're still on the first or second slide. I don't know.
yeah,
Could you
I'm
just...
coming to
Oh,
that.
okay, sorry.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
sorry.
yes. The fourth issue is Pan-African solidarity in terms of scholarship. The Pan-Africanism plays a significant role in intellectual sovereignty by fostering unity amongst African intellectuals, not just to resist imperialism or new colonialism, but also to recognize the value that African knowledge systems on their own have. And what we are seeing is that the issue of self-determination, cultural dignity, and shared values are not so much appearing in this African scholarship. When you measure the different ratings on the production of knowledge across the main publishing networks. And some authors like in Finland, the University of Oulu, there's a geographer there that has been studying what he calls academic apartheid, where the chances of publishing are much, much lower for non-English speakers. So overall, what this leads to is the fact that the knowledge productivity on the continent basically is so low that you would question, is Africa having knowledge sovereignty? What is happening to its intellectual productivity? It means that the knowledge activities and products that are ongoing are not necessarily we would not say there's nothing happening, but that it is not recognized and it's not captured by the systems of knowledge that are run external to the continent. So with this, one of the ways in which we would know whether intellectual sovereignty is there or not is to look at the patent applications globally. And we would look this into the context also of just cross-border patenting. According to Yotrev and Zasoza, who published a paper 2 years ago on determinants and impacts of cross-border patents, the evidence there shows that Africa's productivity as far as patent applications and active utilization, in other words, commercialization of the patents is so low over the last 15, 20 years. It is only accounting to up to 0.6% of the total patent applications globally. And this means that the economy is not so much in African hands, except for a few countries, South Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, and to some extent, Egypt. What we are also seeing from this is that there is more and more a rise of patent figures, and I'll show you in the next slide. that China, which has taken charge of knowledge sovereignty there, has been able to take lead in the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years. They have increased their command for knowledge sovereignty, and as a result, it is on the top of the countries that are active patents as of 2026. They are followed by the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Germany. The impact this has on the economy is that most of the African countries are not filing patents, and instead, more and more United States actors are patenting their patents outside the United States. And so is China and Japan. The result is that Asia has emerged as an innovation hub in the last 2 decades, mostly with China and Taiwan establishing themselves as the new knowledge leaders, so to speak. You may already know that China also actively produces more than 1 million PhDs whom they send abroad. And we have also seen recently that China is more and more turning to Africa for business, but also for workers, for cheaper labor. And that's why you see they are investing a lot also in African education. Sorry. From these figures, you will also see that over the years, the number of patent applications over the years is rising. But Africa in this database doesn't feature. But over the last 15 years, Africa has only appeared in the last 4 or 5 years, where the percentage of patents was only 1.3. One of the reasons for this is that the number of Africans in higher education compared to the rest of the world is very, very small. The total number of Africans who should be in higher education is over 300 million, of which only 9% of those are active players in higher education. This is just also indicating the opposite of what I've said, in that there is a lot more number of people who are not in higher education. It could be the reason of spending. There isn't sufficient funds being invested in higher education, and as a result, Africa is still dependent on the knowledge systems and knowledge products from elsewhere. This means Africa doesn't have its own inherent right or capacity to control and utilize its own knowledge and innovation and convert the resources that it has. If you compare the world map of resources, especially the precious resources, precious and rare earth metals, you'll find especially the Democratic Republic of Congo and some other Central African countries, they are very well endowed with these resources. But they are not the discoverers of those resources. They are not the people who assign value to those resources. They are not the ones who are also converting those resources into wealth. Again, there we are seeing intellectual sovereignty being absent on the continent. There isn't clear systems that have been developed to allow for self-determination over the cognitive assets focused on localized production of knowledge. So does this mean that there is nothing ongoing in Africa? Actually, a lot is ongoing, but the questions are much bigger because this is about how knowledge is produced, who recognizes it, how it's documented and shared, and the meaning that is assigned to this knowledge. For example, you will find in many African communities the practice of what is recognized as knowledge is only accepted if the foreign languages are used. In other words, when we look at access to information, most of the information now would be in the languages that people cannot access, English being one. And that results in that knowledge which they have being disregarded and not accepted. So a pragmatic commitment to financing research and development, student and staff mobility is important because that will be the way in which Africa will begin to recognize, accept its own capability to change its own destination. If we define intellectual sovereignty as a decoupling from colonial knowledge systems, then it means that Africa needs to first and foremost recognize that it must work within itself. There is a greater vision for 2063, but that vision, which speaks of mobility on the African continent, is not being financed, and therefore you find the higher education systems on the continent looking more towards the north and exchanging cooperation and looking for better practice elsewhere rather than on the continent. Africa needs to develop its unique programs that speaks to the continental endowments and increase the South-South to North cooperation, and also recognize that the industries on the continent would not emerge if there is no intellectual sovereignty. At this stage, most of what we are finding, the knowledge products, are a result of innovations from elsewhere, and the resources that Africa has is not being converted here. Instead, it's converted elsewhere and sold back. Lithium, for example, is being mined also here from Namibia without any value addition. As the same for Congo, and knowledge doesn't simply exist to exploit it. My suggestion would be that in the context of the African Charter, a research charter, where there is recognition of the importance of local content, it means we need to increase the collective ability of individuals to carry out productive tasks, and which facilitates the transfer of knowledge, information, products, and technologies created by others. But this would be only possible if there is better systems that doesn't exclude the recognition of prior knowledge that exists in the communities. In summary, What we are seeing is that African intellectuals face challenges such as marginalization, sometimes by the state, but also the corporatization of universities under neoliberalism. These factors undermine intellectual autonomy and the ability to produce knowledge rooted in African realities. Despite these challenges, intellectual sovereignty would allow for Africa to increase its own capacity to create new knowledge, products, and technologies, as well as the transformation of education systems and increasing the creation of curricula that is grounded on the African contexts. The frontiers of science are at the moment being pushed with the epistemic view of the Western world. And I want to believe that it's part of the reason why Africa hasn't seen Nobel laureates in the hard science fields, because the measures of what is excellent conduct of research there is not recognizing the abilities that African systems has. So for some people like myself who would like to consider intellectual sovereignty as Africa's second independence, emphasizing the need for African intellectuals to lead knowledge production free from the domination of the Euro-American knowledge systems. African intellectual sovereignty involves resisting external dependencies and regulatory systems that undermines traditional or indigenous knowledge. For example, the frameworks like the TRIPS agreement and the globalized intellectual property regimes have constrained African policy autonomy and reinforced epistemic subordination. Sovereignty, therefore, also requires African communities to have full control over their cultural heritage, including decisions about digitization and representation, rather than being subject to external mandates. So in conclusion, I would like to say when intellectual sovereignty is promoted in the higher education in Africa, it will increase nations' capabilities to exploit their resources. We will have programs that respond to the continental endowments. In Namibia, we have many endowments of minerals, but we do not have the institutions that respond to those resources. For example, uranium, we do not have as yet a unique program that responds to that endowment. Thus, we need to support better systems that would allow for intellectual sovereignty of Africa to thrive. Africa's development will rise and fall depending on the quality and excellence of its higher education system. But this higher education system, if it's dependent on the Western world's definition of what is good practice, again, we would be falling back on where we have been for long periods. The concern, therefore, for intellectual sovereignty in Africa stems from a combination of historical exploitation, inadequate legal frameworks, and dependency on external powers. Addressing these issues requires a localized intellectual property system, stronger protections for traditional knowledge, and strategic investments in education, research, and technological independence. These steps are essential for Africa to reclaim control over its intellectual and cultural resources in a globally competitive world. The geopolitics currently have shown us that Then countries that have knowledge sovereignty and intellectual sovereignty have power, and they command development than those who don't. I thank you for this lecture, and I'll stop here.